Hello, I'm here with Rory Delargy and David Massey. They are going to take you through 10 to follow for this coming National Hunt season. They are, of course, two of the finest judges in National Hunt racing. Good afternoon, Rory.
Afternoon, Cathryn.
Could you give us your number one selection, please?
I shall indeed. My five are all fairly similar types, it has to be said, but hopefully they'll pay their way. The first one's probably the darkest of the five. A horse of Venetia Williams is called Lower Hope Dandy. Placed in bumpers, took a while to get his act together over hurdles last season. First three runs on heavy ground, but he improved markedly when running at the April meeting here at Cheltenham, when winning a big field handicap hurdle with tons to spare. He could have been called the winner at least a mile from home. Jumped much better, seemed happier on the slightly better ground as well. And the only negative from that run was that he had a bit of a wobble when he came back, finished distressed, and clearly took plenty out of himself on that occasion. But he's got tons of scope. He's a big, rangy son of Karinga Bay who will jump a fence in time, but he remains well handicapped over hurdles, and if Venetia can place him to win a couple of handicaps in the short term, that'd be great. But the future will be long distance handicap chases for him, and I think he's one to follow.
Thanks, Rory. Good afternoon, Dave.
Good afternoon, Cathryn.
And could you give me your number one selection, please?
With pleasure, yes. My first one is going to be a hurdler to follow this year. A bit from left field, it's Bullet Street from Evan Williams' yard. Bullet Street won a Limerick maiden hurdle last year for the Hassets, and then was sent to the sales and has ended up in Evans' yard. He's in the same colours as Court Minstrel, and I've got a feeling he might be sent down a sort of similar route. I think he's a very well handicapped horse. He ran in the Ascot race. First race he ran in was at Ascot on quite bad ground. The race that Far West and River May took part in, and it just turned into a sprint from the 2 furlong pole. He finished 5 lengths behind. But behind those two that day, which sort of showed that at the very least he has a good turn of foot because he was able to go with them. I then saw him a couple of times. I saw him at both Ludlow and up at Market Raisin, where he looked very well in the paddock on both occasions, looked a real superstar. Travelled really well into the race on both occasions, looked like he was going to win, but flattened out both times. He's only young. I'm going to give him a chance this season because something was obviously stopping him from carrying out his finishing effort at various points last year, and I think off a mark of just 1:16 he starts the season on, which looks ridiculously low, and I'm sure Evan Williams will find opportunities for him this year.
Fantastic. Okay, Rory, could we ask you for your second selection, please?
Yeah, second selection is a horse called Batonier of Alan Kings. Didn't run at all last season, but impressed me as a novice hurdler the season before. He started off in handicaps, ran well at Ascot before running in a novice here on New Year's Day a couple of seasons ago. Really on form, didn't have a great chance of getting involved there, but ran a massive race to finish second to Barbatos on that occasion. He then came out later in the month and turned the form around with one or two horses who were around him that day, won very impressively in another 2.5 mile novice hurdle on that occasion, beating a horse of Nicky Henderson's called Broadback Bob. Again, it's easy enough to knock the form 2 degrees, but he gave the impression throughout that season that he was learning all the time. His runs came up to and around 2.5 miles over hurdles. He was always strong at the finish, tended to be held up in his races, and he finished off really well that day to win with something to spare. He reminded me, he runs in the same colours as Charter Party, and reminded me very much of that horse, of course, very well known colours in the racing game. Reminded me of Charter Party, a horse who was a rather slow developer, went handicapping in the first place over fences before ending up being a Gold Cup horse. And I know it's a very, very bold call, but I think Batonier is a Gold Cup horse in the making, and hopefully he can show that this season.
Excellent. Well, that's one for your nag me and your horse trackers right there. David, number 2, please.
Another one for your nag me's and horse trackers, I think, is going to be Henry Daly's Heronshaw, who I saw on a couple of occasions last season. First at Uttoxeter in a bumper, when he sort of came into the paddock. He was very green, but he was lovely looking. He's a chaser in the making. He will be in a couple of seasons' time and make a really nice chaser. This year, I think he'll be going novice early at around about sort of 2.63 mile. When he first ran in the bumper at Uttoxeter, absolutely clueless throughout the race, constantly on and off the bridle, having to be kidded along. Penny dropped with him in the last 300 yards, and he really started to pick up. Beat a horse that day of Susan Gardner's called Trevela Boy, who ran third in the good bumper at Chepstow on Saturday, give that form a little bit of a better look. He was then taken to Ludlow, a track that is going to be, I thought was too sharp for him really, but and a trip of 2 mile 5, which even at that stage of his career you'd think it was too short, and sure enough, 3 out, he's going absolutely nowhere. He's up and down on the spot and he's struggling, and then he's really picked up in the home straight, grabbed hold of the bit, and he's made 5 lengths up from the last to win and beaten a horse of Philip Hobbs called Sausalito Sunrise. He was then taken to Warwick, went straight hurdling after that, and he fell unfortunately at Warwick, but the trip was too short for him. He dropped him back in trip rather than going up in trip, which I think probably looking back was probably a bit of a mistake, to be honest. And I think this season, he's out of Herring Island, one of my favourite sides. He's going to want 2.6 to 3 mile with a bit of mud, and I think he's one to follow this year.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, David. Rory, your number 3, please.
Yeah, slightly more obvious one coming here now. O'Whelan's Boy impressed me a couple of times last season over hurdles for Rebecca Curtis. I went down to the Welsh National and saw him win a novice hurdle there. He didn't win by very far, but he really impressed me with his manner of victory. Very assured in the jumping department, did everything his jockey asked, looked thoroughly professional. And while he was outclassed in the Albert Bartlett, having won at Bangor in between, which will tie into one of Dave's horses hopefully, he ran very well in that race, cutting out most of the running, essentially setting it up for a stable companion, as it were. But he finished 4th in the end. Again, handled the conditions fairly well, jumped to his right a couple of occasions in that race. But he again gives the impression that whatever he did over hurdles was just laying a foundation for what he would do as a chaser. And he appeals as a Welsh national type in time. Obviously, he's won at Chepstow a couple of times already. And that's where I see him in about 18 months' time. Well, not 18 months' time, that'll be shocking timing, wouldn't it, really? But in just over a year or so, I see him being a Welsh national horse. So I don't think he'd be good enough to win something like the RSA this season, but hopefully he'll be placed to advantage and he will develop all the time.
Okay, for what it's worth, I have the same sentiments on O'Whelan's Boy. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for Rory. But David, number 3, please.
The horse that Rory is referring to that ties in with O'Whelan's Boy is my 3rd selection, which is Perfect Candidate, who I make no apologies for putting up after his run on Saturday at Chepstow. I spoke in sort of glowing terms about him on Saturday morning on BetRacingNation. He's a horse I've followed ever since from the moment he came into the paddock here for his bumper, when he did not have a clue, when he was looking round, green as grass. Somebody opened an umbrella up next to him and the horse just virtually spooked himself. He had no idea last year about what he was doing. But this year, everything about him this year already says that he's come on an absolute bundle. On Saturday, he looked a different horse in the paddock. His demeanour was much better. He ran so well in the race. Even though he was up front all the time with Paddy Brennan, he wasn't too free, he wasn't too fizzy. Paddy always had him under control, which was not the case last year. His hurdling was slick, it was quick, which it wasn't last year. He was a bit fiddly over his flights. And if it wasn't for the fact that Killala Key was in the race, you're talking about a Charlie Longsdon horse there that was fit, that was well, that was from an informed stable, and if you took that out of the race, Perfect Candidate would have actually been quite a nice winner on Saturday. He's one to follow. He won a step up in trip. He'll want 3 mile in time. It was 2.5 on Saturday, and it's interesting that he was actually at the 5-day stage entered in the novice chase as well, so presumably that's the route they're going to go down with him this year. I would have high hopes for Perfect Candidate. He's going to make up into a really nice chase this year.
Thanks, David. I must remember that terminology, fiddly over his flights. I like that. Okay, Rory, number 4, please.
Is a horse that we've all heard plenty about, and every time I hear John Joe O'Neill suggest that one of his horses is maybe a little bit too high in the weights, I think to myself, shut the front door. A horse who looked a superstar in bumpers 2 seasons ago, ostensibly disappointing early on as a novice hurdler last year, but those who followed the stable for years will know that there was a plan in that. He was beaten at long odds on in his debut in a bad race at Folkestone. He then rather scrambled home at Wincanton in a race he should have won with his head in his chest, before winning a handicap at Carlisle very narrowly. But again, on that occasion, it was one of McCoy's rides of the season, not because he had to carry the horse over the line, but because he had to do everything he could to win by as narrow a margin as possible. They wanted to get him into the Pertemps final at Cheltenham. He almost needed to win that race to get in. He could have finished second and maybe sneaked in, but he probably needed a penalty to get there. But at the same, actually, he was re-handicapped after that. What he needed to do was win by a narrow margin, so the handicapper would put him up by about £5 to get him on the perfect weight. He ended up winning, I think it was half a length in the end, from Ardkilly Witness. He could have won by 20, to be perfectly honest. And he was then a gamble in the Pertemps final itself. And I thought it wasn't McCoy's finest hour in that race. He was ridden very wide on the track throughout. He was careful to give the horse plenty of time to see his hurdles and measure them, and that worked to a large degree, but I think he gave up too much ground by doing so. He ended up finishing a creditable 4th in the end, but I thought he was better than the bare result. There's just a huge amount more to come from him, whether it's over hurdles He's related to decent chasers as well. I think he's related to Strong Project, who was a decent chaser a few years ago. He's won over 3 miles in a furlong at Carlisle on softish ground. To be honest, I think he'd be perfectly capable of winning very good races at 2.5 miles on good ground. That's probably his ideal conditions, and the world is their oyster as far as he goes. The only problem with following a horse like Shut the Front Door is working out what the plan for this season is, but be assured there is a plan.
There definitely is a plan, and Shut the Front Door would be on my list too. David, number 4, please.
Yeah, interestingly, my 4th is also a horse that the trainer thinks is got too much weight at this particular juncture. I would disagree completely. And it's a horse I saw 2 or 3 times last year win, and that's Green Wizard from Sue Smith's yard, who sort of first came to our attention in a handicap hurdle at Uttoxeter when there was a bit of cut that day. Won that very, very easily, and then was sent straight over fences, and that's when he became such a revelation, really. Came back to Uttoxeter and jumped a small field, absolutely silly. He looked like he jumped fences all his life that day. He's a fantastic looker. He was then taken up to Wetherby next time. I deliberately went up to Wetherby to watch him run that night, and he again from the front, a terrific front running ride from Ryan Manier on that occasion. Just jumped every fence, absolutely spot on, except for the last, which he got wrong. Ploughed through the last, and then then you thought he was going to get picked up by the Tom George horse, the name which escapes me at the moment, but he dug really deep, wouldn't get beat, put his head down, battled all the way to the line, and got there by a head. Were it not for that, he would have won an easy 2.5, 3 lengths really. And back in third that day was Buckle Land from Peter Bowen's yard. In the paddock afterwards, Harvey Smith was more at pains to talk about how the second and third hadn't run their race, clearly hadn't run their races for the benefit of the handicapper, rather than talk about his own horse. But I tell you, this is a horse that's going to go places this year. He starts off this season on a marker 132, and I think there's plenty more to come from him in sort of 2.5 to 3 mile handicaps when there's a bit of cut in the ground.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks for that. And now we're on to the last selection from each of them. So, Rory, your number 5, please.
Yeah, possibly the star performer this year, and a horse that we saw plenty of last season is Rajdhani Express. He caught me slightly by surprise in this, and then I thought he was too obvious a horse to put up. But the more I look at his races, the more I like him, and the more I think he's been missed out by 1 or 2 people. He would have won at Taunton in December, but for unseating or falling with 3 to jump. He then absolutely bolted up at Kempton, and the general consensus was that the race fell apart. He won by 25 lengths, and everyone thought that nothing else gave its running. That was backed up to a degree by the fact that he was well beaten here on was it New Year's Day or Trials Day?
Trials Day.
Trials Day was in the Timeform Novices Handicap Chase. Sam Whaley Cohen tried to ride him under different tactics. He held him up. It didn't suit the horse. He didn't get going even coming into the first fence. Made a bad mistake there, and his race was essentially over. He then did make eye-catching headway at one stage of the race before again making a mistake which cost him his chance. That was in really bad ground. He looked a lot better on better ground later in the season, and he bounced back to win a surprisingly big prize, carrying top weight in the Golden Miller Chase, or the whatever we call the Centenary Novices Handicap, the official title. He particularly impressed with how he jumped there. I went back to that race looking at a couple of other horses, thinking, will I put John Spirit up as a bet? Will I put Shangani up as one to follow for the season? Horses who were better than the bare result there. But the more I looked at it, the more I liked Rajdhani Express. And while others around him were making mistakes, his jumping was superb. I hate the notion that people say if he jumped the fence, he would have won. Well, if he'd fiddled the fence, he wouldn't have won. And the only way he would have jumped the fence well is if he met it on a different stride, which he wasn't doing at the time. Whereas all the way through that race, Rajdhani Express was meeting every fence perfectly. And Sam Whaley Cohen saw a stride again in the last. He could have asked for a big one, he didn't. He just saw the perfect stride and popped it, and he went and won the race easily. A lot of people would say changing times is the horse to take from the race. But for me, the horse who always produces is always the horse to take from a race. And Rajdhani Express is the horse who will go on from that to better things. The obvious starting point is the Paddy Power Gold Cup. He's well handicapped for that as a second season chaser. He's come from the perfect schooling grounds. That Novices Handicap Chase at the festival is always hugely competitive, and is the perfect stepping stone for races like the Paddy Power and the December Gold Cup. And he's got leading chances there. I'd have a go with that for a start, but he could easily become a much better horse than that, a much better horse than just a handicapper.
Okay, thanks, Rory. David, your number 5, please.
I would say when we were doing the long list for this, and Rory and I were getting together, I also had Rajdhani Express on my list for much the same sort of reasons. It's amazing. It's all where you're looking for sort of ones that's finished in behind, but it's amazing how many times the same big handicappers come out both for hurdles and chases for these big races and win them. And I agree with Rory. I think he's one to follow this season. His jumping will stand him in very good stead. My last one is one that I've already mentioned on BetRacingNation when we were sort of asked for a horse to follow this season, and it's Coney. I think he's everything about him that he's done so far, and you're nodding because you know. I think everything that he's done so far, let's play cliche bingo, has been a bonus over hurdles, hasn't it? I believe he's a half brother to Carruthers, isn't he, Rory? Is he a full brother? He's one or the other.
I think he's a full brother.
He's a full brother, is he, to Carruthers, which sort of shows you where he's going to be heading, really. In time, he's going to want a real stay-in handicap chase, and that's where he'll be heading. As far as this season goes, I mean, and last season, the way that he's just sort of galloped around here twice, and the way that he ran Ariel into the ground here was when he sort of first you sort of like, ooh, that was good. Because I think Ariel was a big talking horse that day, and he just made absolute mincemeat of him up here. Let him get within a couple of lengths, said right, bye, and then just run up. He's going to need cutting the ground. That's a big thing. He is a very round action horse, so he's going to need cutting the ground wherever he goes. I would love to think that he's going to come back here for a chase or two, and I think that the Open will be an ideal starting point for him, the 3 mile chase that they have on the Friday, I think it is. But I think, as I say, whatever he's done last season, this season is going to be his season. I'd love to think he can make up into a graded chaser.
Yeah. He's another one who will probably benefit from having missed a chunk of last season. I think when horses go to the well too often as novices, they can leave a bit of a mark, and he picked up a bit of an injury.
He did. It kept him out of the festival.
It wasn't too far from the festival, but of course it meant that he missed a grueling race there. And I don't think he would have been up to it in the Albert Bartlett personally, although the conditions came in his favour on the day. Yeah. That would have been a tough old contest for him, and as an embryonic chaser, a horse who needs a bit of time to develop, that again may prove to be a blessing for him.
Absolutely.
I think, just touching on Coney there, like you say, David, the race here in December when the ground was absolutely horrible, and he put up that relentless gallop in horrible ground. That was the one that caught my eye. So
absolutely,
yeah.
That's when you sort of look and you think, as I say, it all made you sort of sit up and look and think he was going to be a really good horse for next season. I mean, he won at Uttoxeter, but he won at Uttoxeter that I didn't see him that day, unfortunately, because it was the same day as the Open. It was in the November meeting, so I didn't see him win at Uttoxeter. But I think that was his first run that season. So, maybe fresh is a good time to catch him. Well, it'll be interesting to see where they go with him this season.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And as you can see, we are at the home of jump racing, experiencing typical jumping weather. But thanks for watching. There you have 10 horses to follow that you should all put in your NAGME, your horse trackers. I know there's various things that you can do. Go and do it. They'll win. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.